Hello everyone, my name is Paul Ralph. I'm a professor of software engineering at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Canada. Today I'm going to tell you a story about how I cope with the stress of COVID-19, lockdowns, and remote teaching. In March 2020, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. Dalhousie University moved all classes online and suspended all on-campus research operations. I felt stressed, lost, and helpless in the face of a crisis I couldn't control. But I figured, dealing with the pandemic itself isn't my job. My job is studying software developers and helping them cope with this crisis. So I'm going to focus on doing my job. So many developers are working from home for the first time. I want to know how they're doing. This calls for a questionnaire survey. The problem with questionnaire surveys in software engineering is that most researchers don't seem to understand that you can't just write a bunch of questions. You must use validated scales. We didn't have time to create and validate all new scales, so our variables and hypotheses were constrained by the scales that were available. We brainstormed 10 hypotheses: that well-being and productivity will have dropped since switching to remote work, that well-being and productivity vary together, that the change in well-being and productivity depends on fear, preparedness, and ergonomics, and that preparedness reduces fear. We used the WHO-5 Emotional Well-being Scale, Yang et al.'s Disaster Preparedness Scale, the Brasha-Burkle Fear and Resilience Checklist, and for productivity, part of the WHO's Health and Work Performance Questionnaire. We couldn't find any sensible scale for home office ergonomics, so we created a 6-item Likert scale, ran a very limited pilot study, and plowed ahead, hoping the post hoc construct validity assessment would work out. Our study was approved by Dalhousie's Research Ethics Board in less than 24 hours, and we began data collection on March 27th. But we weren't content. Another big problem with questionnaire surveys is that they tend to target Western, English-speaking, industrialized, rich, developed, i.e. weird, countries. COVID is a global pandemic. We wanted to know what was going on in the world. So we translated, localized, and redeployed the survey into Arabic, Mandarin Chinese, French, Italian, Japanese, Korean, Persian, Portuguese, Spanish, Russian, and Turkish. We received 2,225 usable responses from developers in 53 countries. Like with most questionnaire research in software engineering, we just don't know how representative the sample is. But we do have a lot of variance on variables we care about, including age, gender, disability, country of residence, organization size, and experience working from home. Both exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis showed acceptable convergent and discriminant validity, which means the gamble we took on an unvalidated ergonomic scale paid off, and our adaptations didn't break any of the other scales. We only had to drop 2 reflective indicators, which is pretty good for this kind of research. First, we checked whether participants report lower well-being and productivity since working from home. The distributions are quite skewed, so we used the non-parametric Wilcoxon-signed rank test. Both hypotheses are supported. These numbers here are Cliff's delta, a measure of effect size. They indicate a somewhat small effect, which is good news given the circumstances. So, we continued with structural equation modeling to try to explain changes in well-being and productivity. If you're not familiar with SEM, these numbers here indicate how well the model fits. They're acceptable, but not fantastic. These numbers show how the constructs are related to individual survey questions. They're great, no issues here. This number indicates a remarkably strong relationship between emotional well-being and perceived productivity. This number indicates that participants who are more prepared are less afraid. These numbers suggest that the developers with more ergonomic home office setups were less likely to experience drops in well-being or productivity. This number suggests that people who are more prepared remain a little more productive. And this number suggests that people who are more afraid felt a slightly larger drop in well-being. These red arrows represent hypotheses that were not supported. However, because the two dependent variables are so tightly correlated, the paths are somewhat unstable. So, for example, we can be confident that ergonomics matters, but not so confident that ergonomics is more important for productivity than well-being, because it might be affecting well-being through productivity. We also asked participants about how their organizations are and should be supporting them. The good news is that participants report a wide variety of support mechanisms. The bad news is that there was no relationship between the kinds of support participants thought would help most and what organizations were actually doing. For example, about half of respondents thought providing support for employees' children would help, but only 7% of organizations were doing so. Furthermore, our participants disagreed about how their organizations should best support them. So what does all this mean exactly? First, well-being and productivity appear inextricable. This sounds obvious. Of course people are more productive when they're emotionally and physically healthy. But it flies in the face of management orthodoxy. The common wisdom in management is that whoever is best at exploiting their employees wins. Tech companies with free lunches and ping pong tables are anomalies. In contrast, our results suggest that the organizations who best care for employees, physically and mentally, have the advantage. But caring for your employees is easier said than done. Organizations should ask their employees what they need rather than relying on scammy corporate wellness programs. Virtual yoga classes are not going to help if you're trying to work in between watching 3 small children because schools are closed. Support has to be tailored. Now it's been over a year since our data collection, and it's looking like many people will soon return to the office full-time. But working from home has gotten a permanent boost. We need to adapt what we've learned about working from home during COVID to working from home after COVID. We need a lot more research about how working from home affects software developers and projects, and how to best support different kinds of knowledge workers. That said, COVID will not be the last crisis. Climate change is going to be much more disruptive. More research needs to explore how crises, bioevents, and disasters affect team dynamics, cohesion, and performance, as well as software development processes and practices. And that's the story of how I coped with the first COVID lockdown. I'd like to thank Sebastian for helping me manage this beast of a study, Gianisa for helping us get all the medical and disaster stuff right, Richard for sorting out our data analysis, and the rest of the author team for their help with translation and promotion. If there's one thing I've learned from this, it's that a large, diverse research team can help create and execute more ambitious, rigorous, and meaningful research. Thank you for listening.
Welcome back. We are sneaking out from behind the curtains to answer all your questions. Thank you, Sebastian and Vlad, for a fabulous presentation. We've seen all the applause coming in. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks.
And please let us know your questions in the chat. We were just chatting about how it's unfortunate that they couldn't watch the Q&A of the paper right before, so I did my best to summarize it. Let's see if I did it justice, because it's very much related work.
Yes, I guess some of the questions still apply.
Yeah. First one rolling in. Amir, did you all also consider the COVID-19 effects on developers losing their job?
Not really. So we had a filter question, I think, or a demographic question about whether the participant works full-time, part-time, or doesn't have a job currently. But as far as I remember, it was just very few developers who actually participated in the survey who lost their job. So it was not a goal of our study, and also we wouldn't have enough data to look into this, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And when we conducted the study, it was very early, so really in the beginning of this pandemic, and maybe losing a job would have been an effect like after a couple of months, maybe.
Yeah,
couldn't
true
observe
that.
this.
Marvin is asking, I know you mentioned there was some time pressure, but did you take any measures when translating the questionnaire into the many languages to ensure that the translations were valid, meaning of the questionnaire items remaining the same in different languages?
So we had some infrastructure to help in translating the questions, and it was mainly up to the co-authors to support us in that. But luckily, I have one of the co-authors here who can maybe talk a bit about the translation part.
Yeah, basically it was all left to us translators. So I don't think there is a way to really ensure this, but except for trusting the translators to conduct the meeting as well as they can.
Okay, good. But most important answer is you did not just use Google Translate. You had people taking proper care of the translation.
One requirement was being a native speaker in the language.
Perfect. Good. Alex is asking, did you observe differences in subpopulations, demographics, role in the software engineering process, company type, company domain?
Yeah, we did notice some. For example, that we had some control variables, for example, about whether the number of children living in a household, whether the person answering has disabilities, and those factors did contribute to being affected. So having low well-being or productivity. So if you have many children in your household, or if you're disabled, and even gender played a role. So female respondents were affected more.
Mm-hmm. So, sorry, what was the one you previously said? Like many kids in the home affected, and then disabilities affected, and females were affected more strongly. Okay.
Yes, and we're currently working on including information about the countries where participants answered from into the model to also control this aspect. So we didn't do it for this study here, but we're currently still working on it and adding that aspect as well.
Okay, cool. Daniel says, thank you for this amazing endeavor. Could you elaborate a bit on how you managed the research project? You already mentioned an infrastructure, so now we're all curious.
Yeah, so the management was actually a challenge. When we started, it was just 3 authors, and then we invited first people for translation, and then also helping us with data analysis. And what we did is, I did is providing some infrastructure in the form of R scripts that help co-authors in translating the survey and also in analyzing the data, in getting it into one form that we can just merge for the translated questionnaires. But it was a lot of coordination effort. We had 2 options. We had the R scripts, and we had the option to just use Excel for filtering and some recoding. And R script was fine. Excel was a bit problematic. So if I have one takeaway here, then use some form of automation in like R, and not do it in any way manually. So try to avoid any steps, so as many steps as possible in that process that are manual.
Good. Okay, thank you. Lavinia is asking, do you have plans to look again for countries that are still in a lockdown situation in a pandemic?
So we didn't do a follow-up study on this, but I'm aware of at least 2 replication studies that are planned or ongoing. So we published our replication package, including the scripts I just mentioned, and also the questions. And those studies have been conducted, or were conducted, or will be conducted. And I'm pretty sure that some countries in those samples will still be in a pandemic, or were in a pandemic when they conducted them. And I'm really looking forward to the results to see the difference. between our study very early in the pandemic and now a year after, more than a year after.
Okay, thank you. And then Xiao Wei is asking, first of all, complimenting your work. Thanks for the great work. And then, do you think the findings will change as COVID continues from wave 1 to wave 3? Since I heard from some developers that they have mental and negative impact in their productivity over time.
Yeah, I could certainly imagine that. I mean, when we conducted the study, maybe some developers thought, okay, this is a temporary thing. It doesn't really affect me because I'm now forced to work from home, but it will end in whatever, at most half a year. And now it's a year later, and depending on the country you live in, it's still affecting a lot, and maybe even more than a year ago, due to the waves that Xiao mentioned. So I can certainly imagine that. And that's also one reason why I'm really looking forward to the replication studies, to maybe see these effects.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. And then Daniel is asking along those very same lines, like, are you planning a longitudinal analysis? So you said there is replication studies going on, but you're currently not planning a longitudinal analysis yourself, right?
No.
Okay.
And it's certainly important. I think we have it even in our conclusion that this is something we should do, or other researchers should do, but we didn't collect any new data after that.
We don't even have participants originally, so
exactly. Yeah, that's another good point. Yeah, thanks. We didn't track the participants, partly to speed up the ethical review process, because we can say we don't track any participants, we don't collect any identifying information, and therefore, of course, we cannot reach out to them again.
Yes. Yeah. If you were to do this all over again, like, let's rewind time. If you had to do it again, is there anything that you would do different? Apart from making people use R instead of allowing them to manual script.
Yeah, what we did is also to speed up the process. We had qualitative questions, so open-ended questions, but we promised not to publish any of that. Just use it to see where maybe potential issues are with our questionnaire, etc. But there are very interesting replies in there. So we basically limited ourselves in not using that, or at least not publishing any quotes from those replies. But there's a lot of interesting stuff in there, and it's really unfortunate that we cannot use that.
Yeah, that is unfortunate because that's usually really rich data. So what was your reason for promising that you wouldn't reveal that? Also same story.
I think it was also, so we made that decision to speed up the process, to say that it's just quantitative. Most of the data that all of the data that we use for the paper is quantitative, and we won't publish any quotes.
Right. So would doing thematic analysis on them and then just publishing the thematic analysis, but without quotes, that would still be an okay thing to do, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's certainly on my to-do list to do that. We extracted all qualitative replies without linking them to any other data. So we have basically a list of statements that we could just analyze and do thematic analysis, and then write down the abstract representation for each category, concept, relationship that we find in the data.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, we're all waiting for that. You got about 3 months to get it into the next ICSI.
Yes, exactly.
Maybe there's a different outlet. I don't know. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for that. I'm getting more applause here. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
And encouragement to get your paper ready for the next ICSI.
Exactly. No pressure. Okay.